Hi, good morning. My name is Enrique Ordaz. I come from the INEGI and I have been asked to direct this first presentation, which is the one on Professor Dale Jorgenson that we will have throughout a video conference. I don't know if we already have the connection with Harvard. I don't know if Professor Jorgenson is there. Good morning, Professor Jorgenson. Can you hear us? Good morning. Can you hear us? Well, before giving the floor to Professor Jorgenson, I would like to make a brief presentation. He is a great personality. He is Professor Samuel Morris from the University of Harvard and has been acknowledged in terms of belonging to the Philosophical Society of the U.S., to the Royal Academy of Science of Sweden, and Science of the U.S., and Arts and Science Academy, among others associations of which he is member. He has an honoris causa that have been granted for different universities like Uppsala in Sweden, Oslo in Norway, Keio in Japan, and Roma and the Stockholm School, the Chinese University in Hong Kong, among others. Professor Jordan has been president of the Economy Association in the United States and has been founder member of the Bar of Science and Technology of the Research Council of the United States. Professor Jorgenson was born in Montana in 1936, and he has obtained his bachelor degree in the Reed College in Oregon, and then he has a master's on economy in Harvard, and then he was professor in the University of California in Berkeley, and later on he joined the Harvard University, and was assigned Eaton Abbey Professor of Economy since 1980, directed Economy Department of that university from 94 to 97, and is an expert on territory and statistics. He has undertaken research on different fields, technology, and economic growth, environmental, and behavior of investment, and applied trigonometry. He is an author for 267 articles, and his most recent book is Technology of Information and the Reappearance of the American Growth, published in 2005. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Jorgenson. If you can hear me, you have the floor, Dr. Jorgenson. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome.
I regret that this is the extent of my Spanish, and so the rest of this lecture will have to be in English. I would like to join in welcoming you to the international seminar, The Accountability of Economic Growth and Total Productivity in Mexico. And it's my very great pleasure to present for you an overview of the World KLEMS initiative. Let me begin with my heartfelt congratulations to Francisco Guillen Martin and the INEGI team for completing Mexico KLEMS. This data set is a major contribution to the World KLEMS initiative and a milestone in empirical research on the Mexican economy. It will stand as one of the foremost accomplishments of INEGI, the Mexican Statistical and Geographical Agency. Let me begin with a little bit of ancient history. I first discussed this project with the staff of INEGI during a visit to Mexico City and Aguascalientes in 1989. The president of INEGI then was Carlos Jarque Uribe, who studied with me as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. I still treasure a souvenir of that occasion, namely a copy of the Atlas Cartográfico Histórico de México, the second printing of 1988, which was presented to me in person by President Jarque during my visit to Aguascalientes. Second slide. The World KLEMS Initiative was established at Harvard University, where I am speaking to you today by video at the first World KLEMS Conference in August of 2010. The purpose of the initiative is to fill a major void in our system of national accounts. This is the supply side of the accounts, including supplies of the basic factors of production, capital and labor, as well as the supplies of the outputs of all the industries that make up a modern economy. The outputs of the individual industries, next slide please, also depend on capital and labor inputs, back one, and the intermediate inputs from other industries. So capital and labor account for the K and L of KLEMS, and the intermediate inputs are energy E, materials M, and services S. So the supply side of the economy includes all of the outputs and inputs of the industries as well as productivity. This information is organized in the sources of economic growth, which are presented in the OECD Handbook of Productivity Measurement. This was authored by Paul Schreier of OECD, who will address this conference later today, and dates from 2001. The incorporation of the supply side of the national accounts was authorized only very recently in the 2008 revision of the system of national accounts. This system, as you know, is administered by the United Nations and 4 other international organizations and is employed around the world. In national accounting terms, the supply side of the system of national accounts is combined with the demand side, consumption, investment, government, and net exports, to analyze and ultimately to model the growth of the Mexican economy. Mexico KLEMS is particularly timely because it has become available when growth strategy is at the forefront of the policy debate in Mexico. This is a consequence of the Pact for Mexico, a remarkable political consensus about the way forward for the Mexican economy. Growth strategy for Mexico will be very challenging, and each step must be monitored in quantitative terms. This will help to preserve the momentum that has developed around the Pact for Mexico, while facilitating the inevitable tactical and strategic adjustments. The Pact for Mexico, I think, will benefit all Mexicans, but the beneficiaries will also include Mexico's trading partners, and particularly Canada and the United States, which have now been joined for some time with Mexico in the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mexico, of course, is also united with the European Union in a similar agreement, and Canada and the United States are now negotiating trade agreements with the European Union. There will, of course, be additional agreements. For example, the new Pacific Alliance involving Chile, Colombia, and Peru, along with Mexico. And beyond that, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is now under negotiation, and this will add to the leading countries of North and South America, the leading countries and trading partners in Asia. Let me go to the next slide. And here we have a schematic representation of the World KLEMS Initiative. This now involves more than 40 countries, as well as 3 regional organizations: European Union KLEMS EU, Latin American KLEMS LA, and Asia KLEMS, as well as individual countries like Australia, Canada, Russia, and of course the United States. This slide gives you further details, including links to each of the regional organizations, and I hope that these links will be accessible to you through the internet version of my presentation. Mexico KLEMS is the most important contribution to LA KLEMS, Latin America KLEMS, to date, and can provide a template for the development of similar data sets for the other participating countries, specifically Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, as well as Mexico. In addition to that, it will benefit the Latin American countries that will join LA KLEMS, as well as the international organizations that participate in this important undertaking. ECLAC, or in Spanish, CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago, Chile, has provided a leadership role under Andre Hoffman, who is attending this conference. The next slide provides a brief summary of the accomplishments of EU KLEMS. Back one, please. This is the first official project to develop KLEMS-type datasets. EU KLEMS covers 25 of the 27 countries of the European Union and is regularly updated for the leading countries of Europe by the Groningen Growth and Development Center in the Netherlands. 2 volumes have been published reporting the results, but I want to summarize for you the most important finding, which is that EU KLEMS has provided an explanation of the convergence of Europe to the United States before 1995 and the subsequent divergence. The divergence is the consequence of weaknesses in the European implementation of what has become known as the knowledge economy. In EU KLEMS, this consists of investment in human capital, investment in information technology, and innovation. This surfaced before the slowdown in Europe and in the US associated with the Great Recession, beginning with the financial crisis in the United States in 2007 and 2009. The policy implications, again, you can see this on the slide, are that top priority in Europe must be assigned to establishment of a single market in services, especially market services, where skilled labor, information technology, and innovation have been widely deployed in the United States, beginning around 1995. Europe, so far, has been unable to meet this important challenge. And unfortunately, many of the issues discussed in EU KLEMS have been overtaken by the Great Recession. 5 countries of Europe have included KLEMS-type datasets in their national accounts, along with Australia, Canada, and the United States. This is a hugely important feature of the design of Mexico KLEMS, which is part of the Mexican national accounts. This makes Mexico the 9th country of the OECD to provide an official KLEMS data set as part of the system of national accounts. Why is this so important? Let us consider Mexico as an example. First, the Mexican national accounts are updated regularly to incorporate the latest information from the many censuses and surveys conducted by INEGI. Second, the national accounts use double entry bookkeeping of commercial accounting systems that imposes consistency. Third, the accounts in current and constant pesos employed in Mexico provide a four-way check for consistency. Under Mexico KLEMS, this involves both demand and supply in both current and constant prices. This four-way check for consistency provides the kind of reliability over time that will be central in the analysis and monitoring of the Pact for Mexico. The next slides give you the reports on EU KLEMS, and in particular the main report, which was published in 2010, called Economic Growth in Europe. That's where the thesis that I described is laid out. Subsequent to that, in 2012, there was the publication that you see there, Industrial Productivity in Europe, which involved comparison among many European countries, but also between Europe and Asia, and Europe and the United States. Well, let us proceed then next to LA KLEMS. What we have for Latin American KLEMS has already generated a very, very important empirical finding that will undoubtedly be discussed and debated at this conference and for a long time afterward. Over the period covered by this important study, 1990 to 2011, output per unit of input for the Mexican economy, total factor productivity in economic jargon, has not grown at all. Positive growth during many of the years of this period, 2 decades, has been offset by negative growth during the Mexican debt crisis of 1995 and in the aftermath of the US dot-com crash in 2001. And of course, the US financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2009 led to a collapse of trade, fortunately temporary, in 2009 that adversely affected Mexico and the whole of the international trading system. The central finding of Mexico KLEMS is a challenge for growth strategy in Mexico, but also a great opportunity for the Pact for Mexico. It's a challenge because this finding must be absorbed by private and public policymakers at every level of the Mexican economy. This is an important task in which I hope the participants in this conference will play a leading role. The central finding also provides an opportunity for understanding what Mexico can accomplish in the coming years, and the role of events outside Mexico, many of them emanating from the United States, also poses important and unmet challenges for Mexico's trading partners, especially of the United States, going forward. Let me conclude this with a discussion of Asia KLEMS, but first, let's have a look at the important accomplishments of Latin America KLEMS. Latin America KLEMS was established at a conference at ECLAC, CEPAL, in 2009, which I had the privilege of attending, and a report on that conference has been published in 2010, and I believe that is the next slide. But as I mentioned earlier, the most important accomplishment so far for LA KLEMS is the Mexico KLEMS report, which we're here to discuss. Well, let's proceed then with a brief discussion of Asia KLEMS. KLEMS type research in Japan and Asia, this is the report of Mexico KLEMS. KLEMS type research in Japan and Asia has been supported for many years by the Research Institute for Economy, Trade, and Industry in Tokyo. This is an independent research institute sponsored by the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. REITI, to call it by the acronym, will be a leading sponsor of the Third World KLEMS Conference, which we've held in Tokyo on May 19th and 20th of 2014. I look forward to meeting in person with the participants in this conference at ITAM, who will be attending the conference in Tokyo next year, next May. The top priority for Mexico KLEMS I should mention this, the most important results of Asia KLEMS are reported in a book that preceded the development of the Asia KLEMS initiative, sponsored by REITI, which I've already mentioned, and this led to a book on productivity in Asia, which is a kind of prototype for the kind of research that we can expect from LA KLEMS as well as from EU KLEMS in the future. Well, as I've mentioned, the top priority for Mexico KLEMS going forward is to serve as a platform for the analysis and monitoring of the implementation of the Pact for Mexico, the growth strategy for the Mexican economy. While KLEMS-type datasets, like the one that has been constructed in Mexico KLEMS by INEGI and the INEGI team, may seem to be very complex, they provide precisely the level of detail needed to encompass a growth strategy like the Pact for Mexico. Recall that this pact includes 95 specific initiatives, many of them dealing with the key issues on the supply side of the Mexican economy. You are familiar with the debates that are going forward around the energy sector, around the telecommunication sector, and around the tax system for Mexico. All of these involve enormous detail that was impossible to access in a convenient way before the creation of Mexico KLEMS. So now let me mention the priorities for the further development of Mexico KLEMS. First of all, it's very, very important to maintain Mexico KLEMS as a part of the Mexican national accounts, which will be regularly updated so that current information can be brought to bear on the very important issues regarding the sources of Mexico's progress in reviving economic growth, and also the very important structural changes that will take place as the Pact for Mexico unfolds. So the first priority clearly is the analysis of growth and productivity and structural change, which has been initiated by the Mexico KLEMS report. The second priority, however, is not to be neglected. This priority is to link the Mexican economy with the economies of the world, beginning, of course, with Canada and the United States, which are Mexico's partners in the North American Free Trade Agreement. Fortunately, all three countries use the same industrial classification, the North American industrial classification called NAICS. The links among these countries will have to include trade data, but also purchasing power parities, in other words, link among the prices at the industry level for prices in all three countries. Trade data and industry level purchasing power parities for the three countries and for the rest of the world will be required. This will establish the foundations for a detailed study of the international competitiveness of Mexican industries, which is improving rapidly as we meet today. A pattern for the integrated North American data set that I have in mind is the World Input-Output Database, acronym WIOD, established at the Groningen Growth and Development Center in the Netherlands, which I mentioned before. This is now undergoing considerable expansion and updating at the OECD in Paris with support from the World Trade Organization. What will be required in North America is an even more detailed database linking the three countries of the North American Free Trade Agreement with the rest of the world, not only in terms of trade and the levels of activity, the supply of the various industries of each of the three countries, but also through industry level purchasing power parities. Think of that as relative prices. Relative prices for the outputs of the various industries, which will be crucial in characterizing international competitiveness within North America, and also industry level purchasing power parities for the basic capital and labor inputs that undergird supply in the three countries. These are the data that are essential to understand international competitiveness. And I've given you in this slide references to a successful effort to apply this kind of framework within Europe, which is about to be published in the British journal Economic Policy, as well as a link to a paper linking the United States and Japan, which is now being updated under the sponsorship of Rieti by myself and Professor Koji Nomura of Keio University in Tokyo. These will provide the templates for the development of a North American system for understanding international competitiveness going forward. Well, let me conclude then by summarizing my remarks, and then I'll be delighted to participate in your discussion. First of all, the original objective, the vision, if you want to put it that way, of the World KLEMS Initiative, which I've described to you, was to develop KLEMS-type data sets for more than 40 countries. This objective has largely been attained. However, what lies ahead of us is the incorporation of these data sets based on the best available research into the ongoing process of the production of our system of national accounts around the world. This is now consistent with the system of national accounts used around the world under the auspices and the leadership of the United Nations, but also involving 4 other leading international organizations, including the OECD. Secondly, it's necessary now to go beyond the ideas that led to the development of KLEMS-type data sets for many individual countries. Canada, for example, in the year 2002, which has been incorporated from the beginning in the Canadian national accounts, and the United States only in 2012 where a KLEMS type data set was created as part of the U.S. national accounts and is now regularly updated. That, of course, is now joined by Mexico KLEMS, completing the basic KLEMS type data sets for the countries of North America. But for the countries around the world outside North America, the countries of Latin America, countries of Asia, the remaining countries of Europe, the goal for these data sets is to bring them to the level where they can be incorporated into the official systems of national accounts. And we now have clear guidance from the OECD, especially through its productivity manual authored by Paul Schreier, I mentioned earlier, and also a later manual on the measurement of capital about precisely how this can be done at the operating level by statistical agencies like INEGI. However, we now need to expand our horizons beyond individual data sets, and we now begin to think about another level of cooperation. Mexico KLEMS has been employed very successfully in analyzing 2 decades of growth and productivity from Mexico. This has provided interesting empirical findings that will be crucial in formulating growth strategy for Mexico around the initiatives that are already contained in the Pact for Mexico. But the next challenge is going to be to integrate Mexico KLEMS and the KLEMS data sets for Canada and the United States with the world economy data that will be produced by the OECD and the World Trade Organization. And this is what is going to be required to analyze and monitor international competitiveness in Mexico, but also in the other North American countries. I don't need to tell this audience how important international competitiveness is as a policy issue. You heard me describe the many international trade agreements that bind our countries together and that are being developed further to be extended to incorporate other countries in Latin America, but also very important trading partners in Asia, and of course to build on the relationships with the European Union. The regional organizations of the World KLEMS Initiative, specifically Latin America KLEMS, European Union KLEMS, and Asia KLEMS, are ideally suited to serve as the organizational framework in developing links among the participating countries in the World KLEMS Initiative, first for the individual regions, especially in North America, but then between North America and Latin America for LA KLEMS, then in Asia, building on the work that has been done in Tokyo under the aegis of RIDI and is now generated a regional organization for Asia KLEMS, and then finally in Europe, where we have the best established regional organization, EU KLEMS, which was dating now from 2008. Well, I hope I've laid before you both the accomplishments and the path going forward in the development of the World KLEMS Initiative. This has been an effort that has attracted the support of countries around the world, both academic researchers concerned with the issues that we've discussed, growth and productivity on the one hand, and trade, international competitiveness on the other, and is now leading to nothing less than a revolution in our national accounts. We are beginning to see established for the first time a supply side of the system of national accounts that can be combined with the demand side of the traditional national accounting systems, now dating back almost 70 years to their inception during the period of the Second World War. And that combination of the two is going to make it possible to analyze economic growth, to analyze trade, and to build eventually models on a sound empirical foundation that will enable us to develop growth strategies and to compare the alternatives going forward. But we don't need to stop and wait for all of this to occur. We have in the achievements of the Mexico KLEMS team at INEGI a marvelous example of what can be achieved using the KLEMS framework, and the timely arrival of this data set, the availability of this crucial information at the industry level to support the Pact for Mexico, which is now part of the political debate in Mexico, is a marvelous achievement. And I would like to conclude by repeating my congratulations to INEGI, and especially to Francisco Guillen Martin and his INEGI team for successfully launching a new era in empirical research on the Mexican economy. It has been a very great privilege for me to participate in the INEGI ETOM conference, and I believe that this will stand in the minds of all of us, certainly in my mind, as an important milestone in the development of our understanding of the Mexican economy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jorgensen, for your excellent presentation. Ahora, bueno, yo quisiera hacer nada más un par de comentarios. Uno es que se refiere al gran trabajo de compilar la información dentro del sistema de cuentas nacionales, lo que da consistencia a la información, que es una de las características que enfatizó el profesor Jorgensen, y desde luego los retos que él establece al final, uno para analizar la estrategia detallada de crecimiento de México a partir de los datos de productividad.
Because they have tell them to unmute it.
Please unmute your sound.
A ver,
They have
si
it
le pueden
muted.
quitar el
Please
mute,
take
por
the
favor.
mute off your sound.
It's on the video conferencing device. They have, they have a.
Oh, there it is. There it is. All set.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now, Professor Jorgensen?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just restored the sound.
Okay.
It was on mute, I'm sorry to say. So please address your question again.
Well, I was making 2 points on your presentation in Spanish. Entonces, uno, repito, consistencia de datos en el marco de cuentas nacionales, y los dos retos que comentó el profesor Jorgensen, tener un análisis detallado de la estrategia de crecimiento, y el segundo, cómo vinculamos todo el trabajo de KLEMS en el marco de NAFTA en América del Norte y cómo esto se puede incorporar a la base de datos mundial de la OSD. Ahora pasaremos a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Yo veo que hay mucha gente que está con papeles y les voy a pedir que me las pasen, por favor. Bueno, la primera pregunta para el profesor Jorgensen es de Carlos Urrutia, del ITAM, y dice: Thanks a lot for your presentation. I would like to know your view on the possible reasons for short-run productivity drops, as the one observed in Mexico during the financial crisis.
As I suggested in my presentation, the most important impact in Mexico of the financial and economic crisis was the collapse in trade. Mexico is a very open economy, especially open to the United States. And after the Lehman bankruptcy in 2008, a seizure occurred in the World Trade Organization around the world. Wasn't limited at all to North America. It affected Asia, affected Europe, etc. And this has come down to us in the literature as the collapse of trade. Before the end of this collapse, people were already comparing this with earlier experiences like the Great Depression of the 1930s. But fortunately, this turned out to be very short-lived and was essentially over at the end of 2009. But it had left its scars on economies around the world, including Mexico. There were also, of course, issues related to the financial links, and especially to interbank borrowing between Europe and the United States, and to some extent between Asia and the United States. I believe that the impact of this was secondary in Mexico. Mexico was certainly affected, and the financial crisis did affect the trading organization, as I said. But it was the collapse of trade that followed this crisis that I would attribute the major effects in Mexico to.
Okay, thank you. Tenemos otra pregunta de Ricardo Samaniego del ITAM y dice, is there evidence that underestimates of GDP levels and growth and overestimates of capital levels and growth underestimate total factor productivity systematically?
This is obviously a very, very relevant question. Mexico, as I said, has not experienced growth in productivity over a period of 2 decades. If you look at the experience in the world economy, it's really quite different. The past 2 decades have been, by the same statistical standards, a period of exceptional growth, exceptional acceleration in economic growth, and there has also been a very sizable growth of total factor productivity. So my answer would be that methods have now been standardized for measuring productivity around the world. These standards were first of all set by the OECD and by Paul Schreier in his Handbook of Productivity Measurement, and with these standards are now followed by OECD countries, including Mexico, and are part of the infrastructure for the Mexico KLEMS dataset. These standards have now been accepted as part of the system of national accounts by the United Nations. And you can imagine what this involves, literally hundreds of countries agreeing, which took place in 2007 and led to the revision that I mentioned. So we now have a standard set of methods for measurement. And the problem is, and the problem remains, that much of the literature on economic growth was written with an earlier set of standards, dating back more than 50 years to the seminal work at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States and other organizations around the world, which led to a vast overestimation of the role of total factor productivity growth and an underestimation of the role of the basic factors of production. Until institutions like ITAM, and this is central in your role going forward, change the teaching of economic growth and especially growth accounting, which we're here to discuss at this conference, and bring your standards into line with the international consensus that has now emerged, questions like this will continue to plague the literature. It will plague economic discussions and debates, and it will plague the students who are trying to master this important topic so that they can participate going forward in the important work of the Pact for Mexico and similar growth strategies going forward. So my answer to your question would be in the negative. Mexico KLEMS uses the standard international framework and meets the standards very, very effectively. When I first attended a meeting with INEGI in 1989, this was after the catastrophe that affected the national accounts in Mexico in 1980, and it simply wouldn't have been possible at that time to build the kind of data set that INEGI has managed to do. So I conclude that what we have here is fully up to international standards, and if the biases that remain can be continued to be discussed, I think that we'll be able to turn this into the kind of useful tool for policy analysis that I've envisioned.
Thank you. We have another question from Carlos Hurtado, consultant. Your views about the challenges of aggregating labor with different skills. Is there a way to avoid biases in this respect?
Well, it's very important to understand how labor is to be aggregated. It's not just in terms of wages, and it's not sufficient to measure things like educational attainment, which much of the literature focuses on. What's important is to look at the costs of labor, including all parts of compensation. That includes benefits of all sorts, contributions to pensions, contributions to health plans, etc. All of that has to be included in the framework that is laid out by the OECD. And so it's very important to give very, very careful attention to that. In a country in which agriculture and, more generally, unincorporated enterprises are important, as they are certainly in Mexico today, measuring labor input for the self-employed, the unpaid family members, etc., is a very important and difficult problem. And that problem is something that has been confronted by EU KLEMS, by Asia KLEMS, by countries around the world. And so the answer is that we have a very satisfactory method, but it's very important that this be understood, and that the key role of investment in human capital is built into the measures of labor input in a way that converts those measures into a flow in price and quantity terms of the services from human capital, in the same way that the measures for capital input provide measures in price and quantity terms of the flow of services from physical capital. That's the program which is embodied in the KLEMS initiative.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Andre Hoffman. Mexico's TFP was negative for the 1990-2011 period. However, if you look at the yearly results, the recessions are very important. Would you be in favor of using a capacity utilization index?
Well, let me just give you the answer and then the explanation. The answer is no, but what is important here is precisely what Andre emphasized in his question. It's not as if this is an unrelieved picture of gloom. There are periods, in fact the majority of the period covered by Mexico KLEMS, in which productivity growth has proceeded at normal rates, and that's something that we need to focus a lot of attention on. But during the crises, especially these severe crises that we've been discussing, the Great Recession that we are most recently familiar with, but going all the way back to the 1995 crisis, all of these were very, very disruptive, and did cause a severe deterioration in output per unit of input that showed up in the national accounts. And we need to understand more about exactly how to incorporate events like that in the KLEMS system. So that's a very active area of research. Think of that as understanding the role of the business cycle. The main focus of KLEMS research, of course, is on growth and productivity, but we need to also integrate this with an understanding of the business cycle. That is at a much less developed state, and is currently the subject of important research going forward. And I think that's going to be particularly important for LA KLEMS, but Mexico in particular, which has been so strongly affected by these severe supply shocks that we've been discussing.
Ok, tenemos otra pregunta de Leonardo Torre del Banco de México. There are very significant differences in the level of development across Mexican regions. Professor Jorgenson, would you consider also as a priority to study interregional differences of productivity growth in Mexico?
Yes, I think that's a very important priority, precisely because, as you mentioned, there's a great deal of heterogeneity across regions. That's an underdeveloped area in the U.S. KLEMS accounts. In the U.S. KLEMS accounts, which are very, very recent, 2012, so far there is no regional detail within the United States, and as you can imagine, that's a huge gap. But if we look at Canada, which has had a KLEMS data set within the official national account since 2002, more than 10 years, the Canadians also have a very detailed regional system. And so I would strongly endorse what you're suggesting in your question, that it would be a high priority to develop regional accounts for Mexico. Accounts like this have been developed in Europe, they've been developed in Japan, they've been developed in Canada, they should be developed in the United States. But I would say that that's an important priority. I want to emphasize, though, that linking Mexico to its trading partners is, I think, a higher priority. And that's why I emphasize that in my presentation. But I don't mean to downgrade the importance of regional differences. That's a huge issue within Mexico and one worth addressing within the system of national accounts.
Okay, gracias. Tenemos otra pregunta de Banco de México, si entiendo es Marcelo de la Jara. In what ways is the KLEMS approach an improvement over the approach you followed in the 1980s, based on an emphasis on changes in the quantity and quality of labor and capital?
Well, the basic idea of using labor services is something that does indeed go back before the 1980s. It's something that has been in the literature in one form or another since the epic-making work of Edward Dennison and the work that I did with Sui Grelicus, so that this is something that has been very well established and I think has been developed in a way that is now a standard that can be used around the world. The arrival of capital services, though, is much more recent. This was a highly debatable proposition, or highly debated proposition for a long time, and it was only with the United Nations Statistical Commission decision in 2007 to allow capital services to take their place along with labor services in our system of national accounts that it was possible to make progress. At that point, a huge divergence occurred between the old style of growth accounting that you alluded to in your question and the new style. And that new style is captured very effectively in the report by the OECD published in 2009, which is the Handbook for the Measurement of Capital, again authored by Paul Schreier, and you can learn more about that. That was a direct response to the UN decision, which had been germinating for almost half of a decade within the system of a national accounts organization, and that critical step going forward was the beginning of a new era which has led to data sets that I've described to you, but especially to Mexico KLEMS. So what is the advantage of this data set? The advantage of this data set is precisely that it deals in the way that the earlier work did with labor, with capital, which of course is equally heterogeneous. Without this information, we would know nothing, as many people did in the 80s, about the impact of information technology. You remember the famous saying by Robert Solow, and I could quote many other famous economists, Paul Krugman, for example. We see computers everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. That dates from 1987, exactly the period you're talking about. That is an illustration of the limitations of the framework that was replaced in 2007 by the United Nations Statistical Commission decision and subsequently written up in the OECD Manual on Capital Measurement. And that has transformed productivity research around the world, not just in Mexico.
Okay, thank you. We have a last question from Pedro Arco de la Secretaría de Turismo y la voy a intentar traducirlo. Dice, during the last 2 decades, Mexico's total productivity has not increased. How does the KLEMS model or the KLEMS approach explains the growth of GDP with practically the same levels of employment?
The story, of course, is a story of increased quality of the labor, despite the impressions that sometimes circulate. There has been a steady improvement in human capital per hour worked in Mexico during this period that is taken into account in Mexico KLEMS. That is a very important part of the new framework that is presented there. So human capital is part of the story. In addition to that, there has been mammoth investments, both by domestic Mexican firms, but also by many foreign investors in Mexico, that has led to a very substantial capital deepening effect. However, it was impossible to capture this without the methodology that was developed by the OECD and presented in the 2009 report that I mentioned. And so we now have a very clear picture. You might say, given the fact that the world economy doesn't look at all like Mexico, are there other countries that look like Mexico where we have to account for growth entirely in terms of factor accumulation, labor and capital services, human capital on the one hand, but especially in the case of physical capital, information technology? Here's a success story, tremendous success story. Singapore has exactly the same experience. All of the growth of Singapore has been through factor accumulation. Singapore has a higher level of GDP per capita measured by the same standards that we're here discussing for Mexico and for the United States and for Canada. Singapore has a higher GDP per capita than the United States and has had for some time. So there are situations in Mexico, unfortunately, during the last 2 decades has been one of them, in which factor accumulation has accounted for essentially all of economic growth. Well, let me conclude by saying that your questions have been very, very illuminating and very stimulating to me, and it has been a true pleasure for me to participate even by video in this important conference. Regrettably, my teaching obligations at Harvard, which involve a class that took place yesterday and one will take place tomorrow, also includes a lecture that I'm going to be giving this afternoon. And at Harvard, we give our responsibilities to the university our first priority. So I'm very grateful to you for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm very grateful to the technical team here at Harvard in the John F. Kennedy School of Government that has provided this support, and I wish you a stimulating and productive conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jorgensen. I think we have at least 2 challenges: to maintain and strengthen the work of KLEMS and to promote the use of the data that is being produced.
Thank you all, and we shall continue with our program.